Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at English language for GCSE, and specifically we're going to look at how to pass paper 1. Now this can be something that a lot of people struggle with, so it's really important that we follow these 5 steps that we're going to look at to know how to master this paper. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. We've just reached 500 subscribers, so thank you for your continued support and for keep on watching the videos. Let's make a start. Overview. What can you do to make sure that you pass the course? So what we're going to look at now is 5 easy to remember steps to help you be able to manage your time, plan your responses, and actually prepare to take your assessment. So the first thing you need to do in order to pass the course is you need to be able to recall each question. So there are 5 questions within the exam, and we're going to go through them bit by bit in this video, but you need to make sure that you are confident about each question and what you need to do for each one. Step 2. What are the key techniques? Now, when you go through the key techniques for paper 1, we're just going to focus on things like language techniques and structural techniques. So we need to show an awareness of what these are and understand how these are used within modern prose. Step number 3. Can you analyse and evaluate these techniques within an extract? So once you've actually understood the techniques and their function within fiction, can you actually analyse, evaluate, can you break them down? And can you explain the effect or the impact that this will have on a reader? Step number 4. Can you apply your understanding of those key techniques and methods to produce your own piece of creative writing? So if you're already aware of paper 1, you'll know that the creative writing is a very big section of this paper. It's section B for paper 1, and it will be worth a total of 40 marks, which is actually half the marks on the exam. Now once you've mastered all those 4 steps, the next thing you need to think about is develop and practice your timing. So it can be quite a boring or quite a frustrating process. Keep going through English, revising, but it is a bit of an old cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. The more you practice and the more you revise, the easier it's going to be for you overall. For this exam, you get an hour and 45 minutes. And actually the exam board have been quite strict with the amount of time that they give you, so you need to make sure that you are practicing regularly and that you know the timing you specifically need to spend on each question within the exam paper. Step 1. So first thing we need to do, as mentioned on the previous part, is recalling each of the questions. So you should now be able to see a box that comes up on the screen. We've got our questions there on the left hand side, the skills that you need to apply, and the marks that are awarded for each question. So if we go through each one then, for question 1, the skills that you need to know or be aware of is explicit information. Now this is going to be one of the key things that you go through in one of your first lessons within English language, and you probably know what it means already. If you're not too sure, what we mean by explicit information is the obvious or the surface level meaning within an extract. Now this question normally goes from, let's say, lines 1 to 9. It will usually be the very first part of the extract, and it's supposed to warm you up and to get you into the actual mind frame of answering these questions successfully and practicing skills like skimming and scanning to withdraw key information. The marks awarded for this question is just simply going to be 4 marks. For question 2, the skills that you need is to be able to identify and comment on language techniques. And the marks that are awarded for this one is 8 marks. Question 3 is going to be quite different to the language techniques. Instead of commenting on language, we're going to identify and comment on structure or structural techniques. And again, that's going to be worth the same as the last question, which is 8 marks. Question 4. This is one that people often struggle with. Within this question, you're going to have to agree or disagree with a statement. You need to evaluate the writer's method in relation to a statement. Now, so far we've looked at some really key and important words within the English course. You've got words like analyse, agree and disagree, and evaluate. So when you evaluate something, it's actually slightly different to when you analyse it. When you evaluate it, you really need to make a judgment based on evidence. So when you're evaluating the writer's methods, you're thinking about both language and structure, and you are trying to make a critical view on how it's been used in the extract. So for this question, question 4, it's worth 20 marks. So if you can add up the scores on the right hand side there, you can see for question 1 it's worth 4 marks, question 2 it's worth 8 marks, question 3 it's worth 8 marks, and question 4 is worth 20. So what we've got here then, we've got 40 marks, and this will all be on section A. As I said earlier, the question you'll answer for question 5 is the big creative writing one that is worth a massive 40 marks. So for this question, you'll need to write the opening of a story or a description based on a picture. So it's worth 40 marks in total. You get 24 marks for the content and the accuracy, and 16 marks for your spelling, grammar, and your punctuation. So when we think about those 24 marks, we're really thinking about, can you actually apply the language techniques and the structural techniques that we looked at in section A, and can you use it and apply it to your own piece of creative writing? The 16 marks for your spelling, grammar, and punctuation is for your technical accuracy. So you need to make sure that if you do struggle with your spelling, your grammar, or your punctuation, that you revisit it, you read back over it, and you double check in case there are any errors. If you think about the teacher's top tip then, right at the top of the slide, consider how much time to spend on each question in relation to their value. We only get an hour and 45, and when you think about the amount of marks that are available, it's going to give it quite a bit of an edge when it actually comes to answering all of these appropriately in the amount of time that has been allowed for it. Step 2. What are the key techniques? So for this paper, we can simply break down the steps into 2 different sections. So the first one is language techniques. Specifically, these are needed for question 2 and question 4 of section A. The other ones we need to know are structural techniques, and these are needed for question 3 and question 4. So if we think about this for a minute just before we move on, language is very, very important. You can see there it's needed not only for question 2, but also for question 4. Question 3 will need structure, but also question 4 will as well. So question 4 is the one where you use both language or structure, and you need to get into the habit of thinking about it as a whole. A lot of the time people just think about the language, but that won't necessarily help you to get the highest marks available. Now, if you're not too sure about what we mean when we're talking about language techniques, we're going to go through the main techniques that you need to know, not just for paper 1, but also for paper 2. And the way that we can learn these is by using a very simple acronym to help us remember them. So the first one we're going to look at is deforest. And the reason why we're going to look at that one first, because it might be the one that you've already been familiar with. A lot of teachers do use this, or they'll use a variation of this, so you might have heard it in your own lessons. So deforest is an acronym, and each of these letters within the word deforest will stand for a specific language technique that you need to know in order to be successful within the English language course. So if we take the D for example, the D stands for discourse marker. Now this will change sometimes from teacher to teacher. For me, I use discourse marker because a discourse marker is a really fantastic technique to use to help structure your writing. This specifically will help you for paper 2, question 5, where we're going to focus on things like argument writing, persuasive writing, or writing to advise. So a discourse marker will be a word like however, although, or on the other hand. You can also have other ones, such as firstly, secondly, and thirdly, and we call those sequence and discourse markers. So they're very important and really do help you when you structure your response. The next one is alliteration. Hopefully you know this one already. Alliteration is where you repeat the same letter 2 or more times in close conjunction to each other. The next one is a fact. So a fact is something that is proven to be true. The next one is opinion. Opinion is kind of opposite to a fact, so this is often a viewpoint. It's not necessarily something that will be true. The next one is a rhetorical question. So this is a question that doesn't actually require a verbal response. The purpose of this technique is to get the audience to really think about and consider the point that the speaker is trying to make. Next we have repetition. So repetition can be extremely important. If you have a main point you're trying to prove or something you really want to reinforce to your audience, repetition can help keep a certain word or phrase in the reader's mind so it stays with them long after they've finished reading your response. The next one, emotive language. Now, a lot of people actually struggle with emotive language. It's not actually what people generally think, which is that it's about love or hate. With emotive language is actually words or phrases that will get an emotional reaction from the reader. So it's words that will naturally trigger an emotional response with us. So things like someone being neglected or an animal being abused. Those kind of words are very emotionally charged and can be quite effective when trying to persuade someone towards your point of view. The next one is statistic. Now, statistic is one of the few times we mention maths within English, and statistics is when you use numerical data to justify your point of view. So an example of this might be 90% of people love English. The fact that I've used that percentage there, and quite a high percentage as well, makes it sound a little bit more believable and makes it sound a bit more convincing within my writing. The next one is a triplet. Now this is also called a group of three. What it is where you use three ideas or three words towards a common goal. So English is fun, fantastic, and makes me want to jump high in the sky. Would be three positive ideas towards one goal. The next one we're going to look at, and this is going to be a really important one for paper 1, is Go Massive. So there's two main acronyms we need to know. For paper 2, you need to be aware of DeForest techniques, and for paper 1, the main one we're going to focus on is Go Massive techniques. Now there is going to be some overlap, and we see that straight away with the first one. So a triplet and a group of 3 actually are exactly the same. So you can use parts of both acronyms if you want to, but if you're struggling with English language, it's good to keep it clear in your head that you use DeForest for paper 2 and Go Massive for paper 1. The next one then, the O, is onomatopoeia. Now, many of you may have heard of onomatopoeia, but it sometimes is quite hard to define. Onomatopoeia is when we use words that sound like the noise they make. So this can typically be things like bang or crash or something like that, where the actual sound of saying the word sounds actually like the sound we are describing as well. The next one, the M, is a metaphor. A metaphor is when you call something something else. It's a great technique to create imagery for the reader and to actually help boost your writing, especially when you're doing some creative writing. Next one is alliteration. Again, you can see there's a crossover between the Go Massive techniques and the DeForest techniques as well. Next one is a simile. So a simile is very similar to a metaphor, the big difference being that we use like or as when we're saying a simile. The next S is sensory language. Now, if you are doing your creative writing, for me, this is one of the most important things to include in your creative writing. If you're not engaging the senses, if you're not telling me what your character can see, touch, taste, hear, and smell, then it's really limiting my understanding to the world or the scenario you're trying to create for the reader. Imagery. So imagery is what we get when we use our descriptive skills and help actually paint a picture for the reader. A varied vocabulary. Now this is going to be a really important one and something we're going to build on in future videos as well. In order to actually get a high mark, especially in your creative writing, you need to show that you're using varied or even ambitious vocabulary. So try to learn a few words that are a little bit unusual, maybe even ones that are hard to spell, because that will also help you as well when you're getting marked for question 5. The next one is emotive language. Again, same one as we had in the DeForest techniques. And then the thing I want you to think about is to try and stretch and challenge yourself by recalling the technique outside of the acronym. So there are other techniques that we can use. You've probably heard of things like personification or pathetic fallacy or semantic field or anything like that. If you know them, that's absolutely fantastic. But if you're just learning English language for the first time, if you struggle to remember some of the techniques, then this is a really good foundation to start yourself up on. And again, it's all about our step 2, thinking about what are some of the key techniques that you need to pass this paper. Now that we've looked through some of the key techniques, we're going to see if we can evaluate them within an actual extract. So we're moving on now to step 3. You should be able to see an extract coming onto the screen right now. So as we read through it, we're going to think about what kind of atmosphere is being created, what kind of language technique is being used as well. So if you can identify any as we go through, then that'll be absolutely fantastic. So it says then, Jack felt his heart race like a Formula One car as he crept closer to the abandoned building. He called it a building, for surely it could no longer be considered a house. The lingering smell of putrid filth seemed to spew out of every splintered board that covered the black and dreary windows. He moved with the slowness of a snail as he inched closer and closer. Suddenly an almighty crack broke the silence, sending a shiver of dread and despair throughout his body. A strong, powerful, and menacing voice echoed from the darkened building. Jack couldn't understand the words, but the rasp of the voice left him frozen to the spot, transfixed as the sound of footsteps drew nearer and nearer. So if you'd like to pause the video at this point and go through the extracts at your own speed, please feel free to do so. Also try to attempt the stretch and challenge task there, which get you to think about what kind of genre might this be actually alluding to based on the extract. So do you think it's a comedy, a crime, a romance, a horror, maybe a mystery? So think about the language techniques that I've used or the specific word choice of the writer and see if you can work out as well what genre has been used. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move ahead and we're going to start unpicking this extract to understand where all of the techniques are from the writer. Class feedback. Check your understanding against the teacher's answers. So on the left hand side then, we're going to have the actual extract that we've just been through. And on the right hand side, we're going to have the answers from the teacher. So the first thing to point out from is this one. So Jack felt his heart race like a Formula One car. So the technique that was used there, it's one of our Go Massive techniques and it is a simile. We know it is a simile because it's comparing his heart to a Formula One car and it's used the words like to form the comparison. The next one to point out would be the lingering smell. So here we've got sensory language. If it's engaging the senses, so things like smell, touch, taste, hear, and sight, then it is engaging the sensory language, a real crucial thing to include in creative writing. The next one is these very interesting words we have here, putrid filth. So this is classed as varied vocabulary. So we know from that description there and our understanding behind the meaning of those words that whatever is smelling is something horrible and truly disgusting. And the last one in this paragraph, we've got black and dreary windows, which is creating imagery. So all of this paragraph now is helping the reader to form an image or a picture of the house that's being described, and it gives us a kind of sinister or creepy feeling about what this character might encounter. So if we look at the second paragraph then, the next thing to think about would be he moved with the slowness of a snail. So if it said he moved like a snail, it would be a simile, but because we don't have it there and it says the slowness of a snail, we might know that it's going to be a hyperbole. Now this isn't necessarily one that is in the Go Massive techniques, but that's fine because as I said earlier, there are other techniques as well that we need to consider. So when we're talking about hyperbole, we mean over exaggeration. So he's not literally moving at the same speed of a snail, it's over exaggerated to give us this impression that he's moving very slowly and very cautiously as he approaches the house. Then we've got suddenly an almighty crack broke the silence. So crack actually sounds like the noise that's being made, so therefore it would be onomatopoeia, which is the second one in our Go Massive techniques. The next one, we've got broke the silence. Now that one would be a metaphor, and the reason why it's a metaphor is because what the writer is doing is using figurative language. He's not being literal, nothing is actually being broken into, He's speaking about it in a figurative sense. It means that it was completely silent and that one noise has stopped it from being silent now, so therefore he's using a metaphor. Sending a shiver of dread and despair throughout his body. So because we have the repetition of the same letter, D in dread and D in despair, that will count as alliteration. Then we have strong, powerful, and a menacing voice. So what we have here is a group of three or a triplet. So even though this is quite a small example and it's typically the same kind of length that you would get for, let's say, question 2 for paper 1, we can see there that there are a lot of different language techniques and keywords that have been used to create a real effective piece of description. And that's a really important thing to think about. When you are actually analysing an extract, think carefully about the word choice, not just looking out for certain techniques. Think, how has it been described? How has the garden been described in this instance? How has the house been described? And really think about why is the writer chosen to describe it in this way. And then you can start analysing it and think about what kind of techniques have been used as well. So if we think about step 2, and we go back now, we're not thinking about language anymore. We're going to move on and we're going to think about structure. So structural techniques and language techniques, they're two different elements that we need to be clear about. So for structure, we can narrow it down to just a few simple techniques. The first one you absolutely have to know is the exposition. Now the exposition is going to be the start of the novel or the extract. Now when you're in your exam, you won't necessarily get an extract that comes from the start of a novel. It could be from anywhere within the book, but the first few lines will still count as the exposition for that extract that you're given. So you can always talk about how the writer has started that extract, who they're focused on, and why have they chose to start that moment in that way. The next one is a shift in focus. Now this is a really good and easy one to talk about. Essentially it occurs every time the writer changes the time, topic, the person or the place within the novel or the extract. So every single time we get a new paragraph, we have a shift in focus as well, and we can talk about why is the writer chosen to change that perspective, why are we looking at that different character, why has it changed time, or why has it changed the topic. How has that affected the reader? How does it grab our attention or our interest? And the final one, the resolution or the cliffhanger. So the extract will either end with the problem or the conflict being resolved, or leave the reader with unanswered questions, which would be a cliffhanger. So it doesn't matter whatever extract you are given, you're either going to have a resolution where the problem gets solved, something like the good guy wins and the bad guy dies, or a cliffhanger where we don't know exactly what is going to happen and it leaves us with unanswered questions. So if you want to stretch and challenge yourself, you can also download the table to deepen your understanding, because at the moment all we've done is we've looked at the 3 main structural techniques, and again there are going to be broader techniques as well. So if you feel confident and comfortable about those techniques, do try the stretch and challenge task, because that's really going to help you to level up your abilities on this question. Now if we take a look back at the extract that we went through for the previous question, can you identify the techniques that have been used in the extract but only focusing on the structure? So again, when we're thinking about the structure, we're thinking about how the writer has laid it out or organised the information within the extract. So again, we've got the same extracts that we read through before, and we're going to think about how has it actually been put together. So again, I'll just read through it one last time. So Jack felt his heart race like a Formula One car as he crept closer to the abandoned building. He called it a building, for surely it could no longer be considered a house. The lingering smell of putrid filth seemed to spew out of every splintered board that covered the black and dreary windows. He moved with the slowness of a snail as he inched closer and closer. Suddenly an almighty crack broke the silence, sending a shiver of dread and despair throughout his body. A strong, powerful, and menacing voice echoed from the darkened building. Jack couldn't understand the words, but the rasp of the voice left him frozen to the spot, transfixed as the sound of footsteps drew nearer and nearer. Now many people might be tempted to start talking about the language again for this question, But remember, for question 3, for the structural question, we can't talk about the language techniques. If you want to pick out keywords, that's fine, but you can't really analyze it because this is really going to just focus on structure. So the first thing we're going to think about is one of the key techniques that we looked at the start, and that is the exposition. So the exposition is the start of the extract. So for this one, we could say the writer grabs our attention by starting off with action straight away. So question 3 will ask you, how has the writer used structure to interest the reader? And we can see from this one that by starting us off with a bit of action straight away, him approaching this clearly haunted or creepy house, that there's something bad going to happen. So it is grabbing our attention. So it is definitely making the reader want to carry on reading. The next thing we can talk about comes in the second paragraph. And as we said before, whenever you shift time, topic, person, or place, we know that it's going to be a shift in focus. And we clearly know as well that it's changed focus as well, because he's no longer in the same position. He's actually moving forward. Even if it is with the slowness of the snail, it would still be a shift in focus. So the writer has changed the focus as the character moves closer to the house, and this builds up tension. And the fact that it's going slowly as well, it's like something that happens gradually can build up more and more tension as it continues to travel forward. The final thing we'd want to talk about is, has it ended with a cliffhanger or has it ended with a resolution? Again, a resolution would be something where the problem gets resolved, but we can see here we still have a problem. There seems to be a young man who's approaching a house, and whatever is in the house seems quite menacing or horrible and may even be intending to do him some harm. So even though those are just 3 very simple structural techniques, hopefully now you can see how it can actually be applied to any text that you'll see in the exam. Step 3. Which questions will these help you with? So in terms of what we went through so far, so we've looked at question 2, and that will always be, how has the writer used language? So again, if we understand those key techniques, specifically for paper 1, we're going to think about our Go Massive techniques. This would be ideal for this question. The question is also worth 8 marks, and you must analyse the language and the word class within the extract. For question 3, how has the writer used structure to interest the reader? Again, this one is worth 8 marks, and instead of focusing on language for this one, we must analyse the structural techniques that have been used in the extract. And then for question 4, you're going to get a statement that says, a student having read this extract says, you can see there we've got ... So depending on the extract that you've got, you might have a statement like, the student believes that Alice is mistreated in this part of the extract. To what extent do you agree? So within that, you're going to have to take your understanding of language and of structure, apply it to the text, and see if you agree with the statement that the student is making. This is worth 20 marks, so it's really important that you spend a lot of time on this question, practice this question, and feel confident about talking about language and structure as well. The first thing you need to do when answering question 4 is you need to say if you agree or you disagree with the statement. Most teachers will tell you to agree with what the student is saying, and that is actually a really good idea to go with. They wouldn't actually have made the statement unless there's some viable ideas or options for you actually to talk about. You must analyse and evaluate the language and structure that's been used to support your view. So it's all well and good saying if you agree or you disagree, but then you need to make sure you're building on that idea and you're actually supporting it by showing your understanding of language and structure. Section B. Now that we're moving on to look at creative writing, I just want to remind you about step 4. So step 4, as we looked at earlier on in the video, will say, can you apply your understanding of these key techniques and methods to produce your own piece of creative writing? So section A is all about analysing and evaluating, so showing that you understand these things and that you can pick them out from an extract. But now that we're getting on to section B, it's about application. It's about whether you can apply your understanding and actually use those techniques to create your own piece of writing. So in order to achieve a high mark for this section, you need to Apply your understanding of language and structure. Use a range of language techniques to aid your description. Write in clear and coherent paragraphs. And finally, use spelling, punctuation, and grammar in an appropriate manner. As long as you do these things and you keep practicing your creative writing, then you're in a real good position to do well within the exam. A good thing to think about as well is that this question is worth 40 marks, so it is actually half the marks available on the exam paper. So it's really important that you spend that time and you go back over your creative writing. If you need more help with this, then please do check out our other videos that do go into a lot more detail on how to actually craft creative writing, because it isn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. When we take a look at the creative writing question, you'll notice that you'll get two options. So the first one, option 1, will be where you're faced with a photo or an image. This is often referred to as a stimulus, and it is there to actually help you to come up with some ideas and to help actually build on your creative writing. So option 1, you'll be presented with an image. We call that a stimulus. Again, that's supposed to be there to help you come up with ideas. And you'll be asked to write a piece of creative writing around that image. Your teacher won't know what the picture will be beforehand, so there is a little bit of guesswork involved, but as long as you feel confident and comfortable about some of the techniques that you need to use, then you're going to be okay. The second option is where if you don't like the picture, you can also choose to go with the scenario. So this is where we have a sentence that is going to give you a situation. So it might be something like, write about a time when you were scared for your life. Now this is supposed to give you another option. A lot of people do find it quite difficult when they're faced with the image, but remember the idea of it is to actually stimulate you, to help you come up with some good ideas, not to actually restrict your ideas. The marks available for this question is 40, and it's half the marks of the actual exam paper, so it's really important that you spend a lot of time, you keep coming back, and that you're developing your question 5 response. The way that it's broken down is that we get 24 marks for content and organisation. And simply what we mean by this is the marks that you get for the language techniques and the structure techniques that you're using to actually create your piece of creative writing. For technical accuracy, we have 16 marks, and this is looking at your spelling, your grammar, and things like that. So you need to make sure that you're going back over, you're checking your spelling, your grammar, your punctuation, and you're making sure that all of it has been used and at quite a high level as well. The teacher's top tip then is that the examiner is assessing your ability to apply your knowledge of the craft of writing. The story should be secondary to the techniques and the methods that you use. Okay, so it's all well and good if you can come up with a brilliant story, that's great, but it's not really what we're after. It's not really where all the marks are. The main marks are going to be in terms of your content and organisation, which again is about the techniques you're using, and the technical accuracy, meaning your spelling, your grammar, and your punctuation. Look at the student example. What makes it successful, and how could we actually use this response, improve it, and help get more marks with the exam question? So we're using the first option there, so that was going by the stimulus, and now we can see that here is our student example. So I'll read through the first paragraph first, and as I go through, it'd be really helpful if you could identify what works well and potentially the areas that need to be improved and developed. So it says then, as Tom walked along the really old train tracks, he pulled his coat closer to his body because the wind was really windy. There was a smell of gross smoke left over from the last train that got stuck in the back of his throat. Grimly, he set off towards the meeting place. He had no idea why they had to meet here, but he was past the point of caring. Blood was all over his hands like he'd just finished painting. How could everything have gone so wrong so quickly? Just 2 more hours and it would all be over. He could feel his head hurting really bad, but he kept on walking on the old train tracks. Soon it would be over. So the important thing to notice with this one is that this is a first attempt at learning, and with any first attempt at learning we should think about it's not necessarily going to be perfect straight away. There should be areas that we're able to identify that need improvement or developing. So if you are going to practice your creative writing, it's important that you keep all of that creative writing and that you come back to it and you develop it over time. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on and we're going to see how we can develop this. So we're going to look at the teacher's feedback now. So class feedback. Check your answers against the teacher's feedback. So on the left hand side then, we have the extracts that we've just gone through, and you can see here I've already took the liberty of highlighting a few areas that might be important to review or to think that actually works well in this response. So the first thing then, what went well? So these are going to be the things that are in yellow. The first thing, the candidate has used some language techniques. So if we have a look over at the actual copy, where we've got it on the left hand side there, anything that is in yellow might indicate a language technique. So we can see here that it's talking about smell. Now that is one of our sensory language, and we know that's something that's important to use in our writing. The response has been organised using paragraphs. Again, it might seem like a very simple or straightforward point to make, but if you're not writing in paragraphs, then it's going to mean that your response isn't going to get a very high mark at all. I think it will be capped then at a level 2 as well. The candidate has used an interesting sentence starter. The sentence starter we're talking about there is the word grimly, and that is just a bit more of an interesting way than actually starting it off as the or one day or something like that seems a bit more generic. So before we move on and we look at how it needs to be improved, let's just take a closer look at some of the language techniques. Now, we've already mentioned that the smell is sensory language, so the first thing we've got highlighted there would be sensory language, so that would potentially get them a mark. And then it says, from the last train, got stuck in the back of his throat. So also you've got this idea of feeling something but also tasting something. So it's quite powerful imagery that's being used there, because we're able to fully imagine and fully understand what the writer is talking about. The next technique comes with a rhetorical question. How could everything have gone so wrong so quickly? So we see there, that's where the examiner or the teacher has used some language techniques. And if you get this kind of feedback either from your teacher or from an exam, some language techniques actually implies that you haven't included enough to get a higher mark. So how to improve? And we can see there there's quite a few things that has been identified in the blue highlighter. So first one, use varied vocabulary. So let's think about the first sentence then. As Tom walked along the really old train tracks. Really old, we can do a lot better than that, so you need to think about what kind of words could be used there to upgrade that sentence. Because the wind was really windy. Well, of course wind was really windy. You have to think about how you could actually describe it. Maybe even use a technique, use something like personification to really help it to come alive. And when it describes the smoke, it says the smoke was gross. Again, that sounds quite juvenile, and it isn't really the best way to describe it. Gross in what way? How could you describe it? What does it physically taste of? And what does it actually smell of that's getting such an important effect on the main character? We also have some other things to worry about as well. So it hasn't used a range of techniques. We can see there that it has used a rhetorical question and it has used some sensory language. But in order to get a really high response, we're looking for somewhere around 6 to 8 language techniques as a minimum. Check the spelling, punctuation and grammar. So this is where we come into the technical accuracy side, which is worth 16 marks. And if you look there, we can see there are a few elements within the actual writing where they haven't used the correct spelling. The first one might be here. You had no idea why they had to meet here. Now this is actually a correct spelling, but grammatically it is wrong in the way it's been used in the sentence. So this is here as in the sound, but in fact it should be spelled H-E-R-E. Blood was all over his hands like he'd just finished painting. That isn't necessarily a spelling mistake or even a grammatical mistake, but there's no real technique there. It doesn't really add anything, it just means that it's got something that might look like paint on his hands, so it's not very beneficial to the reader. Just 2 more hours. Again, it's used the wrong form of 2 there, so it means TWO, which would be the number. The 2 that's been used is normally used for when you're talking about a quantity of something. Also the word would should be spelled W-O-U-L-D. He could feel his head hurting really bad. Again, we've got this word bad, which is not a very interesting adjective at all. You've got also the adjective of old as well. So it needs to have a little think. You need to think about how to describe it a bit better. And with that line as well, where it says he could feel his head hurting, like what? Is it hurting a little bit? Is it hurting a lot? Does he feel like it's about to explode? There's a real good opportunity here to add some good description, but the student has just missed out on it a little bit. So what they need to do is they need to read back through it. They need to think about their first attempt at learning and think about how they can actually improve it. The first thing to think about as well before we move on is that first attempt in learning, if you can see there that what is actually in bold actually spells out fail. And that's because your first attempt at learning, it's not going to be perfect. But the more we do it, the more we come back to it, review it, and try and improve it, then the higher marks you can gain. Second attempts in learning. Look at the response after the learner has had feedback and made some improvements. So now what we're going to think about is the idea of keeping your writing and looking back at it and actually making those improvements. And this is really where we actually learn how to grow as writers. So without this process, we're really not making that next step from being people who are getting to grips with writing to people who are being actually successful and comfortable within the process. So now that the learner has actually had a bit of feedback, let's see if we can identify ways that this response has actually been improved from the previous one. So it says then, as Tom walked along the old, decrepit train tracks, he pulled his coat closer to his body as the wind struck out at his exposed flesh. There was a lingering stench of burnt coal left over from the last train that plagued the back of his throat. Grimly, he set off towards the meeting place. He had no idea why they had to meet here, but he was past the point of caring. Blood was all over his hands like the hands of the devil. How could everything have gone so wrong so quickly? Just 2 more hours and it would all be over. He could feel his head throbbing so hard he was sure it was about to explode. Gritting his teeth, he kept on walking on the devastated train tracks. Soon it will all be over. So hopefully now you would have been able to identify a few ways that this response has improved from the first attempt at learning. If we look at one of the first things, for example, it's thinking about the actual imagery that's being created through the use of varied vocabulary. And instead of just saying it's a really old train tracks, we're going to use a word like decrepit. And this is a really effective adjective because it allows us to actually imagine that this has actually been broken down and it's kind of wearing away as well. The next thing that might stand out to you is this sentence. So he pulled his coat closer to his body as the wind struck out at his exposed flesh. Now the word struck here is quite an aggressive verb, and it also helps us to personify the wind. So wind isn't obviously a human action or anything like that, or something that's controlled by humans, but by saying that it struck out, it's creating that imagery that the wind is actually alive. We also have the word here, exposed, and then flesh. And this helps us to think about how the cold is actually attacking the parts of his body that he can't quite wrap up and shield himself against the cold weather. The next thing was when we talk about the sensory language. Now, sensory language is one of the main things that you want to be thinking about when starting your creative writing, because it really allows the reader and the audience to visualize what you're talking about. So there was a lingering stench of burnt coal. The fact that it is lingering and a stench is a lot more effective than just saying it's a really bad smell. Stench is a really good word because it tells us in no uncertain terms that this is a very horrible or nasty smell. And again, we've got burnt coal, so being a bit more specific, the fact that it is on train tracks, and it gives us this idea that it's not a modern one. This actual story might be set a little bit in the past as well. And then we've got the final sentence within the paragraph. So you can smell the stench of that burnt coal left over from the last train that plagued the back of his throat. So rather than just saying that, it smells so bad he can taste it, we're using that word plagued, which is very aggressive, and saying the fact that it's in the back of his throat is a really good use of imagery and sensory language, as we've all kind of experienced that sensation before. If we look at the second paragraph, they've actually done something very successful, and this is the first thing that a lot of people forget to do when they're actually doing their writing. A lot of people forget to actually think about the sentence starters. So starting your sentence with an adverb can be really effective. So I haven't actually underlined it here, but I will highlight it. So using this word grimly is better than just saying the man grimly set off. So using an adverb, it starts us off right in the action for the sentence, and it starts the story moving on at a fast pace straight away. So it's a really good way to start the writing. The next thing to think about was blood was all over his hands like the hands of a devil. Now, of course, this is a simile, but also it's a lot better than the last one, which was because he had just finished painting, or like he had just finished painting. The fact that we're using this simile there is going to get us some more marks. Also, the devil has very negative connotations, and it's creating some very effective imagery for the reader, making you think that this person has gone through quite a dramatic or even a violent ordeal. The next thing is that you can see that the student has gone back and they've actually made the adjustments in terms of the spelling, the grammar and the punctuation. So instead of saying T-O-O, it's used the appropriate form of to. It's spelled wood correctly. And then we're talking about this feeling within his head. So rather than just say his head is aching or it's hurting, you need to quantify that. Everyone can have a mild headache, but how bad is it? Now, if we're trying to make out that this person has gone through a really serious or upsetting ordeal, we want to try and make it sound as bad as possible. So he could feel his head throbbing so hard he was sure it was about to explode. Now, the student has actually thought about this quite carefully, and they've used an example of hyperbole or over-exaggeration to say how much pain and discomfort the character is in. Now, the final bit, gritting his teeth, he kept on walking on the devastated train tracks. Soon it would all be over. So quite similar to the way he's actually started the second paragraph, rather than starting it in a very generic way of like the man walked or something like that, it said that starting it with an actual action, so gritting his teeth, he kept on walking. Again, this is all just really nice little touches that is giving us a little bit more information about the character. And the students actually thought quite carefully about a real key skill, which is showing and not telling. If he's gritting his teeth, we know that he is quite anxious, maybe he's angry, and maybe whatever it is that he's heading towards is something that might end in violence or some kind of confrontation. We also think about the final adjective that is being used to describe the train tracks. Notice at the start of the paragraph it used the word decrepit, and now it's used the word devastated. So even though these words are quite similar, they might even be considered synonyms in some cases, the candidate has made sure that they're actually thinking about the word choice and they're not repeating the same words over and over again. Now, sometimes repetition can be effective, but if it comes with adjectives and you're describing a person or a specific place in your story, you want to make sure that you're trying to mix it up a little bit, or as much as possible, because it's that varied vocabulary that's going to help us to move on to the higher marks within the exam. When it comes to our creative writing, here are just a few things that are really important and key to remember. So the first thing is how you are gaining your marks. So in order to make sure that you're gaining enough marks to get a pass or even higher than that, you need to think about your language techniques. So have you used a range of language techniques? If we think back to the example that we looked at and the feedback that was given by the teacher said they have used some language techniques. In order to get up there in terms of levels like 6 or a 7, you need to use a range of language techniques, which means at least 6 to 8 language techniques in your response. Structural techniques. Have you structured your writing appropriately? So this is not just about whether you've used paragraphs, it's also thinking about your sentence structures, how you've presented the information to the actual audience, whether you've zoomed in, whether you've zoomed out, and whether you've used any of the other structural techniques that you would have learned during your course. And the final one, SPAG. Have you used a range of sophisticated spelling, grammar and punctuation? Now this is often one of the biggest areas that gets neglected when people do their creative writing, and that's why it's important to always spend that time to go back, reread it and double check. If you haven't used things like colons and semicolons or hyphens or things like that, then that is not going to be what we call advanced punctuation. You need to use those in order to make sure you're getting a high mark for the technical accuracy. fail and sail. So these are the two things, or the two processes, that we looked at when we were going through the creative writing. So the first one, the fail, this is called the first attempt at learning. So it isn't going to be perfect. It's your first attempt, so you need to learn to get used to the idea that it won't be perfect first time. So when we're practicing our writing, don't get disheartened if you write something and you think it's rubbish. The main thing to do with this one is that it's actually, if you think about it, more valuable, because you're supposed to go back, you're supposed to identify the areas that need to be improved and learn as you progress through the process. And then when you get onto the second attempt in learning, this is where you use feedback from your teacher to improve your writing. Without this, you won't be able to improve. So it's one thing about attempting the creative writing, but you should never throw it away. You should never just leave it. Make sure it gets marked by someone, have a little bit of feedback, and then revisit it, see if you can actually improve it and upgrade it. And that's just going to make your general skill and your ability when it comes to writing that much more better, because you're naturally going to start thinking, what kind of techniques do I need to use in order to make this successful? So the teacher's top tip, as I said before, never throw away your creative writing. Try to improve and rewrite your creative pieces and get used to drafting and editing your writing. Managing your time, step 5. So if you feel comfortable about all the other steps that we've been through, now we need to think about managing your time. Now within the exam, paper 1, Explorations in Creative Reading and Writing, we only get 1 hour and 45 minutes. This is the standard amount of time given for the exam paper. It might be that you've got additional time, and that will be something that is worked out with either your college or your school, but most people are just going to have 1 hour and 45 minutes in order to do the full exam. Now this isn't a load of time at all, so you need to be careful by managing your time. You need to practice the questions, and the more you do it, generally speaking, the quicker your responses should get. So for question 1, it's worth 4 marks, so you should aim to spend about 5 minutes on this question. It is a good idea to actually sit there at home while you're practicing your mock papers and time yourself for each question. So if you can get it done in 5 minutes or slightly under that time, then you're doing well. Question 2. Again, question 2 is our language question. It's worth 8 marks, and essentially all we do is we round up and we say that should allow us 10 minutes. For question 3, we're also going to spend 10 minutes on it because it is worth 8 marks as well. Question 4, so you get 20 minutes for this one and it's 20 marks. In terms of the quantity that you need to be writing, you want to aim for anywhere between 2 to 3 paragraphs for this response. And the final one, question 5, 45 minutes, and that should be 40 marks. Now you can spend up to an hour on this one if you want to, but that's really going to cut into your margins. If you can practice and get it down to 45 minutes and produce 5 good paragraphs in that time, then you'll be in a real strong position in order to pass the exam. Extension. Test your understanding by recalling the details for each question. So this is going back to step 1. So here we have our 5 questions on the left hand side, and you're going to see a number of different hints or clues relating to the questions that we've been through. So the first one, which question is it where you have to identify and comment on language? The next one is, for which question you need to evaluate the writer's methods in relation to a statement? The third one is, identify and comment on structure. The next one is 40 marks. You get 24 marks for content and 16 marks for spelling, grammar and punctuation. And the final one is where you have to identify explicit information. So if you'd like to pause the video here and take your time and go through them in a little bit more detail, please feel free to do so. Hopefully, if you've been listening carefully to this video, you should be able to work out which statement goes with which question. But if you're not too sure, it is important that you look back and go back over the video, go back to step 1 and make sure you feel comfortable about each question and what you need to do for it. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones on the right. So here we have it then. On question 1, it's identify explicit information. And if we can recall what we mean by that, explicit information is the obvious or surface level meaning within the text. Question 2 is where we identify and comment on language. So again, with that one, you need to make sure that you have a strong understanding of the language techniques before you attempt the question. Question 3 is where you identify and comment on structure. Question 4, evaluate writers' methods in relation to a statement. And question 5, this is the big one that's worth 40 marks, 24 marks for content and 16 marks for spelling, grammar and punctuation. So here's our teacher's top tip then. So try to answer question 5 first. It's worth half the marks of the paper, so you must not leave it until the last minute. Year after year, there are people who don't get enough time, or they forget even to have a go at question 5, and that is potentially one of the worst things that you could do in the exam. Because it is worth just so many marks in that exam paper, you have to make sure that we prioritise question 5. Now that we're reaching the end of the video, it's important to point out that we do have additional resources available. So we upload a new video every single week to help you improve and focus on your English, and we focus on specific elements each week as well. So for example, if you want to build on what we're doing today, check out our other video, which is English Language Initial Assessment, which helps you to get to grips with some of the key skills that you need to know for the course. Again, we do upload a new video every single week, so do check them out. Please like and subscribe because it really helps us out when you do so. If you need any extra support or need any extra help, the new videos we add every week. Alternatively, leave us a comment and we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. If you still can't find what you're looking for on our channel, please do check out our partner channel, Bookworm Teaching, for more lessons and guidance on all things English. Thanks ever so much for listening, guys, and all the best with all your work and revision in the future.